welcome everyone. We're going to get everyone seated in this virtual room and just provide a few more seconds as those who are not here are entering currently, and then we'll begin with the introduction, and then we'll quickly turn it over to our presenter today.
Welcome.
Well, good afternoon if you are here in Indiana on Eastern Time. Good morning if you're in Indiana on Central Time, and anything west of Indiana Central Time, good morning. So good morning, Leslie, to you as well. Welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar, Introduction to Cria, ndome, Reparenting Ourselves While Supporting Our Youth. My name is Kevin Enders, and I serve as the Director of Social Emotional Health here at IYI, and we're so glad that you've joined us for today's presentation. We're grateful that you have the chance to connect with us, and that we have a chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers that remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and children throughout the state. And Leslie, if you'd be able to switch to the next slide here.
Sure.
For those of you who are, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yep. For those of you who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. So listed here, you can see the values that drive the work that we do at Indiana Youth Institute. And these aren't just our values, these are values that we see across the state and the youth organizations that we serve. Before we begin, I'd like to share just a few pointers that will help you engage with today's webinar. So more about some of the logistics taking place. And on the next slide here, you're going to see just a heads up about what's taking place. So for any technical support issues, use the question section on the toolbar on the right side of the screen to send a message to Casey, who is IYI's Program Manager of Conferences and Trainings. She is behind the scenes to assist you. And if you cannot see that toolbar, click on that orange arrow. We also encourage you to ask questions, so please use the question section for any questions you may have, and we'll get to those as many as possible. So if it's relevant, we'll stop there right in the middle of the conversation, or we might even hold some of those questions to the end. But we encourage you to use that question section. You will notice that on your control screen toolbar, you can download a copy of today's PowerPoint, as well as other resources provided by our IYI's data team. And if you cannot see the toolbar, click on that orange arrow. Later today, you're going to receive an email link with to complete an evaluation for this webinar. IYI is very data driven, and we do the work because of the feedback that we get. So if you can please take a few minutes on that survey to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And if you don't receive an email evaluation by the end of today, check your junk or spam folder because it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of IYI's webinars, today's webinar will be posted on our website, and if you'd like to revisit it for a portion later, or even share it with an opportunity to listen to some friends or colleagues, that will be accessible to you via IYI's website. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Leslie Priscilla is a first-generation non-Black Chicana with Rurumuri lineage. She is a mother to 3 bicultural children and a certified parent coach with over 14 years of experience. Leslie shares her medicine by offering coaching, workshops, support, and advocacy for Latinx and Chicanx families locally, nationally, and internationally via Latinx parenting. Leslie's vision is a movement rooted in children's rights, social and racial justice, the individual and collective practice of nonviolence and reparenting, intergenerational ancestral healing, cultural sustenance, and the active decolonization of oppressive practices in our families towards liberation. We look forward to today's presentation, so let's get started, and please join me in welcoming Leslie.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and welcome everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you all this morning, or this afternoon for you. I was just sharing with Kevin and with Casey that My husband's family is from Indiana, so when this collaboration and this connection began, I was very excited. We also have one of our team members at Latinx Parenting that lives in Indianapolis, and so all of these connections back to Indiana are very, very exciting for me on a personal level and on a professional level. So thank you so much again for just making this connection. This workshop is going to, I hope, give you a sense of validation. I hope it gives you a sense of holding and of connection with yourselves. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff. We only have about an hour. This could easily be, probably a 3 to 4 hour workshop. And we do offer, additional offerings that I will share later down the line if this is something that is interesting to you and you want to look into it further. But welcome to Criándome, Cuidándome, Reparenting or Remothering if you're mothers ourselves while supporting our youth. So I want to just very briefly, because we cannot see each other, I just want you to sit with these questions. What is your intention for our time together today? What drew you to this workshop? Why are you here? What are you expecting to gain? And so as I'm naming these questions, I do just want you to sit with what the intention is. One of my teachers always says, the saying goes, where attention goes, energy flows. And he always says, where intention goes, energy flows. And so it's really important for us, especially those of us who are working with families, with youth, to always carry an intention as you're entering into that relationship and that connection with them. And so this will be a good practice in doing that. So what kinds of opening and expanding might be able to happen? What judgments and expectations might need to be noticed and quieted. For example, I was telling Kevin and Casey, I don't normally sound like this. I'm recovering from some kind of cold that I got from my kids over the weekend. But I'm trying to quiet down the judgments of the way that my voice sounds right now and extend compassion to myself about it. And so I invite you to do that the same. If there's anything that's present, that's alive in your body right now, in terms of judgment or any kind of self-evaluation that might not be as kind, I do encourage you to try your best to shed that, to release that, and to be as present as you can as we spend time together this morning. So just with that, we're not going to have a lot of time to really get into everybody's responses to these questions. And so again, just sit with whatever that response might be. So I'd like to share a little bit about my story and about who I am. So Kevin was so sweet in sharing a lot of my credentials and my personal experience and the reason that Latinx Parenting exists. But one of the primary reasons that this organization exists and why I do this work is actually for this little girl on the left. And this is me when I was in 4th grade, I believe. And during this time, it was pretty tumultuous. There was a lot of chaos in my life. My parents were splitting up, and I didn't really feel like I had any adults in my life at that time that were really for me, right? That were able to support me, that were able to hold me, that were able to name what was going on, right? That were able to give me the kind of validation that I needed. And so I remember during the school year, I went to Catholic school my entire life. But during the school year, I would get a lot of stomach aches. My mom would take me to the doctor. They wouldn't know what was going on. And so later in my life, I realized that I carried a lot of anxiety, especially during this time. And so, I think about the ways that I didn't have those adults in my life that were able to provide those things. And for a long time, I carried a lot of judgment towards those adults, right? Namely my parents, namely my mom. Because my dad wasn't really present by that time. And so she was the one adult that was around and that I felt should have been there, right? Like you should have mothered me the way that I needed you to mother me. And then as I grew older, I started really learning about how she grew up and about her story and about the fact that she experienced similar things about her parents, right? Her father actually passed away when she was 14 years old and she had to migrate at that time in order to work. She was one of 12 children. She was the 6th child. And so there were 6, little children under her. under the age that she was, that she had to immediately begin to support and send money home, right? And so I started to grow a lot of compassion for her story and for the little girl that she was. And I remember, a few years ago when I was pregnant with my second child. I am a mother, as Kevin mentioned, and I have a 4.5-year-old about to turn 5 in October, actually. But when I was pregnant with her, I was going to therapy, and there was a lot that was coming up for me during that time, around the pregnancy with a second child. And so in therapy, we started to kind of work through the ways that I hadn't really fully integrated my mom's story, my grandmother's story, my ancestor's story into my own, right? And so I invite you to really think about what your story might be and the way that that story is woven into the lineage of your ancestry as well, of your bloodline, of your family, right? How are those strands being braided? And also recognizing that our story, as individuals, are not our parents' story, right? It's a different one, and at the same time, we have the ability to weave it together. And so I encourage you to think about, what your story might be as a child, what your parents' childhood might have been like as well, what your grandparents' childhood might have been like, and you might already have been doing those reflections. And I invite you to continue to do them if that's the case. So this work is really guided by this philosophy or this saying. I don't know exactly who said it first. I'm sure that there's been a lot of iterations of it throughout the years, but I'm just naming it as the way that I like to see it, the way that I like to remember it, is be who you needed when you were younger. And I'm sure a lot of you who do work with youth came into this work in order to be that safe space for the children and the youth that you're working with. And I certainly did, right? So I was a preschool teacher for a very long time before I became a mother. And that's why I went into early childhood, right? I went into early childhood because I recognized all the things that I did not have. And I wanted to be that for somebody, right? And what was left out of that was that I really still needed to be that for myself, right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today in terms of reparenting. Oh, sometimes that happens. Okay. So what impacts our narratives about ourselves? And I'm going to be going through all of these in more depth, but I just want to name them here. Intergenerational and ancestral trauma. A lot of us who, especially those of us that have grown up within marginalized communities, we might have an understanding of trauma as something that happened in our childhoods, or something that it might have been like an event or some kind of natural disaster or something that happened that was really huge, right? And so those things are generally seen as things that happened within our lifetime. And we now know, just based on research and based on things that have come out, especially in the last few years, that historical trauma is something that is still carried in the bodies of people who have experienced that historical trauma. And so intergenerational and ancestral trauma has something to do with the way that we view ourselves, and sometimes that's very unconscious. And so we'll talk about that more in a second. Colonization or colonialism, culture, and patriarchy, we'll talk more about those as well, and the ways that they might have impacted our views of each other, right? Our views of ourselves as well. Perspectives on children. The organization I run is Latinx Parenting, but the way that we view children is pretty global. It's pretty universal. And so it's not just unique, right? It's not just unique to my culture, to my family. And so again, we'll talk about that shortly. And any unmet needs that we sensed in childhood. So anything that we did not receive, affection, attention, autonomy, all of these needs, all of these universal human needs that we all hold when we come into this earth. And if they are not met, then that's going to generate a feeling, an emotion, a thought, a sensation. And from those will sprout some behaviors, right? So we'll talk about that again. And then now as adults, right now as adults, those of us especially that come from marginalized groups, any challenging relationships that we have with our parents. So for example, I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants. Both of my parents migrated here. And And so, they were stressed out like that. There's not a more plain way to say that, right? They were pretty stressed out. And so that stress never really went away, right? And so now we are navigating not only the reparenting of my inner child, but the reparenting of their inner child in many cases, within the ability to set boundaries, which I've become very good at doing. But there are challenges that still sprout out, right? And so, so any challenging relationship that we still have with our parents, or any complexity that's a part of those relationships, may impact the narrative about ourselves. So just checking to see. Okay, I don't see any questions come in or have come in, so we'll just keep going. So we can inherit trauma. And I mentioned this a little bit ago. We often operate from wounds that will come to the surface and activate us, right? We don't always know, it's not always predictable when they will happen. We may not be consciously aware of them, even as we are experiencing those triggers, right? And so I don't necessarily actually even like to use the word triggers because, well, actually somebody that I know once that was a victim of gun violence actually shared with me that even the word triggers may be triggering to somebody who's experienced gun violence. And so now I use the term activations. And actually, for me, it's a better word because I think about how it really truly is our nervous system becoming activated. So when our nervous system becomes activated, we may externalize that, right? I'll show you in a little bit, but I use the analogy of thorns. So those activations that are externalized are like thorns that we have grown to protect us. And our parents and our grandparents may not have been aware of their wounds or of their thorns, and then those may have been projected onto us. And we, as our children can, or as the youth that we're working with can, they can also become conditioned to believe stories about their worth and their value based on the woundedness and based on the thorns that have grown in the people that are their caregivers, right? And sometimes that's us, right? Sometimes that's us if we're the ones that are working with youth. We're human beings, and so we're going to project every now and then. We're going to project our own stuff onto them. And so we have to be very, very aware of where that's coming from and what the roots of that is, or what the roots of that are. And so let's talk a little bit about the ways that colonization, culture, and patriarchy have impacted us. And again, I'm looking at it from the lens of the Latinx population, right? And so we have had certain systems and certain institutions and just, ways of being that have impacted us in really negative ways. And I will never say, that any of these are, just in a binary, just, this is bad, right? But each of these have taught us different things about ourselves, right? So gender roles and patriarchy, for example, what does it mean to be good in general? What does it mean to be a good girl? And if we grew up in Latinx culture, or, any culture really, but we know that what's acceptable for boys is different than what's acceptable for girls, right? To be a good girl is different than what it means to be a good boy. And so that's one of the impacts that these gender roles and living in a patriarchal society has had on the way that we view ourselves. Comparison, right? Just any forms of comparison that breed competitiveness, that breed scarcity, mentalities that breed fear-based thinking and power over mentalities. So, the idea that if you win, that means I lose. If I win, that must mean that you lose. And so these are ideas that we've built into our programming, that we've grown up conditioned to believe, and so that aren't necessarily even the truth, right? Religion as well. So any shame and guilt around any acknowledgement of harm that our own parents may have caused or other adults in our lives. And so there's a lot of, reflection that we have to do around what actually happened, and what our childhoods really were, right? So there's a lot of shame and guilt around the acknowledgement that perhaps our parents or the adults around us, even though they did their best, they may not have been able to give us what we deserved, right? And so I have this piece here around the fourth commandment, because the fourth commandment is honor thy mother and father, and yet honor thy children isn't necessarily a part of those commandments, right? And so I remember growing up, and there was always this, it was like a gold-plated list of the 10 commandments in Spanish in my kitchen at all times. And so as a child, I remember looking up at this thing and reading these commandments, being like, wow, this fourth commandment, like I really feel this one, because I know that if I speak my needs, or if I say no, or if I say I don't really want to eat anymore, this feels, dishonoring, right? It feels dishonoring of my parents. It feels dishonoring of this commandment. And so there was a lot of fear bred in this way. Again, I'm not going to say religion is bad. You'll never find me saying that. And at the same time, we do have to be very, very self-reflective about the ways that religion may have created certain senses of shame or guilt, right? And so I have this piece here also about martyrdom and Marianismo. A lot of Latinx families and Latina mothers especially experience this urge to self-sacrifice, right? And to become martyrs for their families and to set their needs aside. And it's all social conditioning, right? I'm not saying every Latinx family is like this. I certainly, don't sacrifice. I do sacrifice a lot as a parent in general, but I try to be very mindful of not going into a space of martyrdom and of not going into a space of, really resenting my kids for taking care of my own needs. And so we have to really be aware of how that manifests in our lives, if that is something that we experience. And colonization, right, and colonialism. And so what I mean by that is that there was this attempted conquest on this land 500 years ago. And so it also shifted everything, right? It shifted the dynamics in our families. And it also bred a lot of disconnection from not just each other, but from ourselves, right? So a lot of us have grown up disconnected from our bodies, from our needs, from just being able to recognize intuitively what's going on, from our gut senses, right? We have the saying of trust your gut. And oftentimes we've grown up in these conditions where it's been very, very difficult to trust our gut, because that's not what's valued, right? What's valued is trusting your head, trusting your cognitive senses, your thought processes, etc. And so these are just some of the ways that this may have impacted our ideas of ourselves. As I mentioned, the way that we view children, it's not at all unique to Latinx families, right? So the idea that children need to be fixed, the idea that children are inherently wrong, or that they're sinners, right? That they have this original sin. As children, many of us, whatever culture we come from, were punished for acting like children. We were encouraged not to listen to our cues for comfort or for eating. And if we were all in person, which I hope that we will be very soon, but I would be asking you to raise your hand if you identify, but if you identify with any of these. So if you were punished for acting like children, raise your hand, right? And if you were encouraged not to listen to your cues for comfort or for eating. So if you were told to stop crying constantly, if you were told that you had to finish your meal even though you were full or you weren't very hungry, if you were rewarded for bypassing your childhood or for being mature, right? That was something that was always celebrated. Oh, she's so mature for her age. If you were ever told to suppress any emotion or deny any piece of your reality, if you were ever told that your needs didn't matter, and so your needs may have gone unmet, right? That was certainly the case for me, for a lot of people that I've worked with. And so we just want to be very mindful of a lot of what we were taught, right? A lot of the messages that came through. As a result, we may have been wounded, but we learn to adapt within the perception of our parents and our caregivers' judgments, right? And so if I was told that I was being too loud, too rowdy, that I needed to be quiet, right? That I was too much, then I learned to temper that and not be rowdy and not be loud, because if I continued, then that would mean that, I might not feel that love for my parents anymore. I experience this now with my daughter, who is the person that I would have been had I never been told those things. And it can be very activating, right? I can be very like, oh, I really want to say some of the things that my mom said to me or that my dad said to me when I was a child. My daughter's almost 11 and she's just very hyper, right? That was the word that I was given as a child. I was just very hyper. And so I really struggle sometimes to not project that onto her and to really see her for who she is and to celebrate that, right? And yes, there are times where I'm like, I really need quiet, I really need space, and so we're doing this dance together where she's learning my needs and I'm learning hers. But I think about the ways that that wasn't necessarily given to me as a child, right? It wasn't, it wasn't about this learning a dance. It was more just like, you will dance the way I tell you to dance. Otherwise, I will step on both of your feet as hard as I can. um, and so for those of us that grew up in those kinds of conditions, that we may have engaged in strategies that helped us to survive those painful experiences. We may have acted out. We might have rejected that altogether. Get off of my feet, right? Like, I don't want this. I don't want to be around you. We may have shut down. We may have stormed off. Or we may have pleased our parents just for that survival, right? I would rather please my parents than be this person who my parents don't like, right? And so that's something that a lot of us have carried into adulthood now, where we're not able to set boundaries. We're not able to say no when we mean no. We're not able to say that doesn't work for me. That's not within my capacity. And so this is all something that we're learning. We may have acted out. We may have shut down. We may have, oh, I just read that part. But our thorns really have, the thorn analogy that I gave earlier, are those that grow from this need to protect that sweet essence that we still carry, right? And so I give this example of my partner. I remember this years ago. He asked me to do something really, like, it wasn't even a big deal. He asked me to, like, take the garbage out, I believe. And he said, can you take the garbage out? And I was like, do you think I was not going to take out the garbage? Like, is that what you're saying? Are you calling me lazy? Are you saying that I don't think about, And so I just spiraled into all of these narratives that were old recordings that I had, really integrated into my view of myself, really, is what it was. And he stopped me, and luckily, we had gone to couples therapy before this, and so he really understood his role in getting me to kind of slow down. And he stopped me and he held me by the shoulders, lovingly, sweetly. He was like, you're not in trouble. I'm not yelling at you right now, and he was very light about it. He was like, I'm not yelling at you right now. You're not in trouble. And I just realized, like, oh, wow, I have these, like, thorns that come out, and they may poke him, right? And they may poke my children, if I don't recognize what's going on, right? If I don't recognize that those things are the things that I grew to protect. And I'm not judging those thorns, but I am wanting to be very cognizant of when they do come out. Oh, so the first concept with reparenting, beyond all of the narratives that we need to examine that we may have adopted, is the idea of the inner child, right? And so this is the way that we define the inner child. So it's the unconscious parts of ourselves that still remain. Our inner child makes themselves known when we sense any woundedness arising, right? So any feelings of self-doubt, any feelings of I'm not worthy, of I don't deserve this, right? And so this is the case for our youth, who are still, they're still in their youth. And so we want to be aware of the ways that younger versions of themselves are emerging, right? And also, as we are working with them, we want to be aware of the ways that our inner child is coming out based on something that they might be projecting or reflecting back to us. So our inner child signals to us our unmet needs, including our need for play, our need for creativity, our need for laughter, also our need to be able to cry freely, and our attunement to ourselves, right? And so the process is asking myself, What is it that my inner child is needing in this moment? Is my inner child needing, right? Is my inner child needing to eat this, pint of ice cream at 1 o'clock in the morning before I go to bed? Or is my inner child needing to just go to bed, right? And so a lot of people think that this inner child process is very like airy fairy, and it's like, oh, you're just validating yourself, you're just giving yourself the right of way every single time, you're letting your inner child take the wheel. And that's not the case, right? This is a disciplined process of really understanding what the need is that our inner child is experiencing, not necessarily what the want is. Because my inner child may want to slam the door on my partner, may want to eat that pint of ice cream, but it's not what they're wanting, it's what they're needing, right? And so really getting to know our inner child is going to allow us to understand what the need is, and therein be able to translate what those needs are for the youth that we're working with, for our children, for other adults in our lives even, because we can understand that that person might be acting, it might be their inner child at the wheel, right? We may not be encountering their loving adult self, their inner parent. We may be encountering their inner child. So these are some signs that our inner child is making themselves known. So any feeling of persistent anger and rage, sulking, right? A lot of sulking and negative thinking about ourselves, overreacting to things the way that I described with the request to take out the garbage. I'm overreacting. I'm like, how dare you ask me to take out the garbage? This must mean you think I'm lazy and that I don't take out the garbage ever, right? So that's like a complete overreaction. Or underreacting. If somebody shares something with us that's very heavy and we don't respond appropriately, right? And we're not able to hold it for them, and we're just like, you'll be fine, and we just kind of move on because it feels too much for us to be able to hold with them, right? And so that's an underreaction. And that might be a sign that our inner child is there at the wheel as well. Any intense or overwhelming emotions, defensiveness, self-sabotaging behaviors, distractions, addictions, anytime we go on our devices, right, and we're just like mindlessly scrolling to avoid whatever it is that might be heavy or that might be challenging. This is kind of like where I go, right, when I know I'm like, oh, that's where I am. I am completely, checking out, I'm tuning out. There's a need there, right? Is that need actually being met by mindlessly scrolling on Instagram or on, TikTok or whatever it is? And probably not, right? It's probably not what is meeting the true need to be present with whatever emotions are feeling like a burden. Again, people pleasing and self-betrayal, not being able to hold boundaries, just being a yes person all around, just, can you help me with this? Absolutely, I'm there. Can you take on this project? Absolutely, I'm there. I used to do that, right? And it was really, really difficult for me to begin to set those boundaries because I felt that if I did set a boundary, that would be disappointing that person. And the worst thing in the world was to disappoint a person that I cared about, right? And still I feel myself being like, oh, I really have to like grapple with this feeling of disappointment or potential disappointment if I honor this need in myself. And so all of us have a little bit of that because all of us grew up in a culture where adults were the ones that were centered. And so their feelings, their needs, their right to feel respected from you as a child, etc., was really the priority, right? And so a lot of us have this challenge that we have to recognize when we are betraying ourselves by pleasing others, right? By not honoring our boundaries, by not honoring our capacities. My friend and I were laughing last week. We went to lunch. Maria, who's also on my team, she's been one of my best friends for the last 11 years. And we were talking about how, sometimes people, because we're very compassionate people will come into our lives and request, even my mom still, right, she'll come and say like, can you fill out this application for me? And she's, again, a Mexican immigrant. So I've been filling out applications for her since I was probably 7, right? Since I was probably the age that I was able to read and write. And so we were relating on this and we were thinking about this word compassionate. And it's like you can have compassion and you have to be able to recognize what your capacity is. And so we kind of like merged it together, and it's compassion. And I, you can go and you can use it. I was like, yeah, you should. I told her, I was like, one day you should write a book and you should have it be called compassion. And the shitty part is actually spelled like the word shitty because it feels really shitty sometimes. But it is a process, it is a practice, and it is one of the ways that we heal our inner child. Or holding unattainable expectations for others to meet our needs, right? So the expectation that my partner, that my children, that the youth that I'm working with, if I'm giving them suggestions, if I'm giving them any kind of guiding or a path forward, and they don't take that and they don't do the things that I'm asking them to do, how does that make me feel, right? Does that make me feel rejected? Does that make me feel unheard? Does that make me feel like my need for reciprocity isn't met? And so being able to communicate that instead of saying like, well, they just don't listen to me and it must mean, et cetera, which we do all the time with our biological children, with children in our lives, or with just other adults in our lives, right? And so we have these expectations of others to constantly be meeting our needs. Okay, and then Kevin, just checking in, I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm not missing anybody's questions.
Yeah, we actually have had a question come in, so I'm gonna
Oh,
read it verbatim here.
sure.
So as you talk about scarcity, colonialism, dismantling binaries, etc.,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about how practicing liberation on a personal and familial level helps move us toward collective liberation. And
Yes.
is someone invested in liberation at every scale? Can you share more?
Yeah, and so the opposite extreme of liberation is oppression, right? And so we're going to get to the ways that we practice that self-liberation. That self-liberation is the way through it, in my opinion, at least the way that I've been able to kind of get closer to that has been this reparenting process, right? It has been to recognize all of the ways that I have been oppressing myself because I've been internalizing a lot of the oppression from either the family that I grew up in, from just the systems that I grew up in, right? The media and the representations of Latinx people, for example. And, I was thinking about this song, Mexican Americans. I don't know if y'all ever watched Cheech and Chong. I was probably too young to watch Cheech and Chong when that was coming out. But, even just the song, like, Mexican Americans don't like to get up early in the morning, but they have to, so they do it real slow. Like all of these messages come in, and we don't necessarily always have the time, especially for those of us that are more, that come from marginalized groups. We don't have the time or the privilege. A lot of times, my parents certainly did not, to really examine all of the ways that messaging becomes internalized and becomes a form of internalized oppression, right? And so moving out of that internalized oppression, again, for me, the way through has been to remother myself, has been to really examine what recordings, and in the 8-week course that I have, we really list out like all of the messaging. What are my beliefs about partnership? What are my beliefs about money? What are my beliefs about worth? What are my beliefs, right? And so all of these things, it's like there's all of these pieces of this puzzle that we have to look at, right? We have to like look at it really closely and say like, okay, does this piece actually fit? Like I might have been like forcing all these pieces to fit, but does this actually fit in my puzzle, right? The puzzle that I want to create for myself. And that puzzle is a liberated one, right? That puzzle is one of liberation, of being able to act from authenticity, and from a place of knowing my needs and being able to communicate my worth and my value and hold boundaries and take accountability. So we're going to get to those steps shortly, but I really appreciate that question. Thank you. Thank you so much for asking it. Okay, so these are some other, red flags, right? These are some flags that our inner child is waving, like, I'm here today. Our outer children and our partners are then left to cope with our inner children, right? And so if you feel like, okay, this person's constantly having to cope with me and vice versa, we may be these two people on the left. This is I forget what the art is called, but this is an installation from Burning Man here in California from a few years ago. And so this really shows the disconnection, but the intention and the hope that these inner children might at some point connect, right? And so it's been really supportive for me that my partner has been able to go to therapy with somebody that's been trained in the same modality that my therapist was trained in. And that's the modality of inner bonding. Inner bonding was a modality developed by oh my gosh, I'm forgetting her last name. Her name is Margaret. But if you Google inner bonding, right, you'll find the books that she wrote. And so this is a modality that really has informed, the way that I've kind of taken on the reparenting work. But we may be, unknowingly again projecting a lot of these strategies to meet our needs onto our partners, onto our children, onto the families that we're working with, onto the youth that we're working with, onto our coworkers, right? And so again, recognition of like, who is at the wheel? Is it my inner child, or is it my inner parent that is telling me you're overreacting right now? You don't have to your feelings are very much valid, but we don't have to behave in this way, right? Like, your needs may not be met. You may feel like your need for collaboration or contribution or affection, whatever it is, that your need is not met. But do you have to yell, right? Do you have to get on this person in this way? Do we have to say these things, right? And so this happens with my children, and this doesn't happen so much anymore because we're fortunate enough now to be able to homeschool our older daughter. But getting to school on time was something that really, really showed where my woundedness was still buried, right? And so I remember going to school and just being screamed at the entire way to school, right? Just through my adolescence, later in my childhood, right? But definitely throughout high school, whenever I would get dropped off, it was just like I was just going to hear how slow I was, how lazy I was in the morning, and how I don't support, and my mom is, how much work she does, and making lunch, like getting lunch together. And so again, like, she was so stressed out. She had a lot of unmet needs as a single mom. But I found myself doing the same things, right? And so my daughter was like in second grade when the pandemic hit. And so second grade, first grade, I noticed that was happening, that I was repeating that pattern. And one day I just looked at her from the mirror as we pulled into the drop-off line. And I was just like, wow, like, here is little me. And here is me as my mom, right? Like, here we are again. And do I want to continue that? And so I had to have some like very serious reflection around what I wanted to continue and what I really needed to shed, right? What I really needed to do in order to pause and to recognize how that woundedness was emerging so fast, right? Like, it just happened so fast, where I was telling her like all of these terrible things that I used to be told as a child as well. And so she might have to heal from that. Like, I don't necessarily know how internalized that is at this point, but there were commitments made, and there were behaviors changed and shifted, and really thinking about, what does this actually work for us if this is the pattern that's continuing. And keeping spaces clean as well. A lot of us grew up with moms that were very adamant about keeping the space clean because it gave them a sense of control. And I have had to really check myself when I start going down that rabbit hole as well, and start really thinking about the ways that I might prioritize keeping spaces clean over my children's feelings, right? Over protecting them from, anger that might arise if that space is not clean. Oh, and then the second part of it, it's not the last part, but because of timing, this will be, the part that I would like to cover more in depth. But the inner parent is the one that will acknowledge and validate the inner child. And so this is the one that says, I see how devastating this is for you right now. I see how activated you are. I see how hurt you are. I see how sad you are. I see how rejected you feel. So this is the inner parent really having that conversation, really validating in ways that our parents may not have been able to do for us. The inner parent reflects on who is appearing in the wounds, who is, or yeah, who is there, right? And where in our bodies as well. So where is that occurring? Is it in my gut? Is it in my heart? Is it in my throat? It holds space, it stays with whatever tension that is. It brings expansion into that part of the body. It gives our inner child whatever they may be needing in the way that they needed it, and it soothes our nervous system, right? And so again, we don't want our inner child at the wheel. We want them next to us, but we want to have the inner parent being the one that's driving, right? Being the one that is really guiding where we are going. So these are some gifts of reparenting ourselves for our inner children. We see overall increased resilience. We want to get to a point, right, as we are raising children and as we are working with children, where children don't have such a need to be resilient. I have a love-hate relationship with resilience, because resilience is really the reason why I am still here, right? The reason why I'm still alive. There were times where I didn't know, if as a youth, as an adolescent, whether I wanted to be alive anymore. I definitely engaged in behaviors that, were, self-harming behaviors and that kind of thing. And so resilience is the reason I'm still here. And at the same time, there's a level of resentment that sometimes happens with having to be so resilient. But increased resilience, the sooner we can start reparenting ourselves, right? The sooner we can start recognizing that our parents may not be able to meet those needs for us, whether we're adults or whether it's the youth that we're working with. And I'll share with you something that that one of my first counselors, when I went to college, I became pregnant really young, 23. And at the time, I did not think that was that young, because I felt like I had been a little adult for so long, right? And I went to therapy, and I was really there to figure out how to fix my partner. And so, that really bit me in the butt. And it ended up being that I had a lot of woundedness to work through in my relationship with my mom, right? And in releasing control around my expectations of him and things like that. And so at one point, as we were going through the relationship with my mom, my counselor at the college that I was going to, she said, you really have to decide whether you want to continue to pour water into this bucket that has a hole at the bottom. Because I would tell her, I'm like, I'm trying, right? I'm trying to please her. I'm trying to be this good daughter. I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that she's happy, and it's still not working. And that's what she said. She said, you keep pouring water into this bucket with a hole at the bottom, and it really is up to you to decide when you want to stop doing that. And it really made me think. And I still, to this day, that was, over, 13 years ago. And so I'm still bringing this up because it still is very, very supportive. Self-compassion for our stories, accountability, our own accountability, the ability to say, I'm sorry, I messed up. My inner child was at the wheel. I did not mean to project my wounds onto you, right? So this language and the ability to be accountable, safety and autonomy, creating that safety for ourselves, recognizing that we have autonomy with our behaviors, with our choices, setting healthy boundaries, and just healing overall, right? So just the sense of like, yes, I am on this path, I am healing. Releasing expectations of our own parents, our partners, and our children to meet some needs and validation, offering ourselves validation and approval. Just kidding, it's supposed to say approval. Being gentle with my inner niña as I notice this typo. Modeling, allowing ourselves to identify and request their own core needs to be met, right? And so I've often had to translate what my partner is saying. And I have so many stories of the way that this has happened where I'm like, okay, clearly, right, like your inner child is at the wheel right now. This is not, my adult husband talking. This is your woundedness. And so we have to work through that. But overall, there's also less misunderstanding when I can translate what's going on. Same for my mom, same for really anybody, right? Increase compassion for others and their processes and their journeys, right? You may not be at the point where you can really recognize that your inner child is being activated, but I can see where you are in your journey, and I don't necessarily attach myself to expecting you to be anywhere else, right? And so, so much compassion, again, compassion for their processes and their journeys. So how do we build this skill? And I'm just being very cognizant of the time here. I'm only going to give a few out loud, but you are going to be receiving a workbook. And actually, I think it's here in the sidebar. You can download this workbook and you can access all of the things that we're about to see on the slides. And obviously, if you ever want to reach out and go deeper into this process, there is a way to do that. But oops. Okay. So these are the pillars of reparenting. I've already talked about a lot of them. One of the ones I haven't talked about enough has been joy and play. So a lot of us have a hard time playing with our children, right? Playing with, yeah, just kids, with youth, right? Maybe you're working with youth actually because you have a lot of access to this, and that's really awesome. But I really encourage you to find the ways that you like to play, right? That your inner child still likes to play. The music you like to listen to when you were a kid, play it, and find joy in that, right? And so bring a lot of joy. There's a lot of grief that's a part of this process, but we need to balance that with equal amounts of joy, right? Community care, I think, is a really big one as well. So many of us feel like we've been burdens all of our lives, and asking for help has been really difficult. And so making sure that we're receiving that care as we are nurturing others, as we are offering that care to others, right? You can't, I mean, the saying goes, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You can't put your oxygen, you can't offer oxygen to anybody unless you have your oxygen mask on. Very cliche, also very true. Right, and so take a look at these, print this out if you want to, write this workbook, this e-workbook, and really sit with what these might mean to you. Oh, these are some exercises as well. The biggest one that I suggest is to have some kind of imagery, whether it's a picture of yourself. I feel very fortunate. I have a lot of pictures of myself as a child. My mom, not so much, right? She has a couple, but have some kind of picture of yourself as some kind of representation of the fact that your inner child is still very much present, is still very much needing your attention, your validation, and really just honor that child as much as you can every day with doing something for them, right? What would she like to do? What would he like to do? What would they like to do to feel good today, to feel held today, to feel supported today? And so having that visual reminder is very, very supportive, as are some of these other exercises. And so again, you'll get all of these in this workbook that you have access to today. And so I do encourage you to take advantage of that. These are just some images that I really love from this Instagram page, the Doodle Doc, which is very inner child focused, as you can see. And so these affirmations are very helpful. I'm reparenting my inner child. My inner child is showing me what is truly important. We help each other. I got you. Funny thing, the more I listen to and honor myself, the better I can hear you too, right? So all of what we have shared in a nutshell. So again, you have the companion workbook with exercises and additional resources, additional reading materials as well that I recommend, that I have vetted, I have read. There is also an 8-week reparenting course that I offer. At this point, we are just on waitlist. We are not offering it immediately, but if you go to latinxparenting.org/waitlist, you can sign up to be a part of the waitlist, and as soon as it's open, you are able to access it. So I would love any feedback, any questions that you may have. And so I will go ahead and check in with Kevin to see if there are any questions that have come in after that initial one.
And thank you so much, Leslie. And we do have a question here. Have you dealt with family or systems that minimize your experiences and the effects they have on us as individuals, on our children, and on as a collective society?
Yeah, I deal with that a lot. I deal with that a lot. It goes back to that slide where we're talking a little bit about patriarchy and all these things. Like, we are swimming in these systems, right? We're swimming in the systems of white supremacy. We're swimming in the system of patriarchy. We're swimming in it. And so it's everywhere. And the way that it's manifested oftentimes is through these interactions that we have with people that are generally seen as authority figures or in power. And I'll give the example of having it be, at a personal level. People generally center themselves. And this process is not about centering ourselves in a selfish way, right? Again, accountability is a big part of this, and being able to discern what the truth is about what's going on. But I'll give you two examples. So one example was when I was a preschool teacher. So I think I shared at the beginning, I was a teacher for many years. And before I became a mother, I had 12 children in my classroom at any given point, and that was stressful. Right? I was exhausted. I was young. I had the energy. I could never do that now, as somebody who's 35 going on 36. But I I loved it, and also it was exhausting. And I remember once riding in a car with my mom, and she was, I was expressing to her that I was really struggling, that I was really tired. And because she was taking like my silence personally, I wasn't really wanting to engage. And I was like, you know what, Mom, I'm just like very tired. I had a very long day. And she started making it about herself and saying, don't you think that I've had a bad day? Don't you think that all of these things that are pretty narcissistic, and I hesitate to use that word, but it is that centering of yourself in a very protective, very defensive, very thorny way. And so, I said, can't you just hold, right? Like, can't you just hold what I'm sharing with you? And she was like, no, I can't. I cannot. And I was like, okay, actually, I don't feel sad. I feel liberated, right? I feel freed from the expectation that I held that you would be able to hold this, that you would be able to listen to this. And so I think we need to meet people where they're at, however much grief that might be encountered in that, right? And so the individuals that are a part of these systems, because these systems they don't just operate on their own. They're filled and full of individuals that perpetuate a lot of the toxicity that comes into those interactions for us, right? And so, for example, that interaction just in that car came from so many years of my mom feeling unsupported by the systems that she was in, right? We were a part of Section 8 housing. We still are. My mom is still in the Section 8 housing program, so they pay for the majority of her rent. But I remember growing up in the way that they would, social workers would speak with her was very demoralizing, was very dehumanizing. We were just numbers, right? They weren't really there to be present with us. And so that might be a reflection of how undersupported that social worker was in that space as well, right? And so all of this trickles down into our interactions, and I've experienced it a lot. And I also try not to take it personally, as it's not really a reflection on me, right? It's not a reflection of who I am or what I have to share or how I'm here to express myself. And I don't necessarily need to let it continue to infiltrate the way that I operate, the way that I engage with others. And so I hope that's a little bit supportive. I do have another example of it that's more recent, but I will save that for the next time that we meet. And I hope that that's a little bit supportive. And Kevin, is there anything else that's come in? I know that we're really close to the 10-minute or my 10 o'clock mark, your 1 o'clock mark.
We are, you're right, the end of the session, right?
Mhm.
In any time zone we're at. We do have one more quick question, and then then I'll transition to wrap it up.
Sure.
So what do you do if photos of you as a child are triggering? Is it still reparenting if you don't imagine your inner child visually?
I will tell you that there are other ways to connect that are not visual, right? And so again, like, I really invite you to come into other space with other people that are doing this, because I have heard so many suggestions that are not even here, where it can really just be, a guided meditation of seeing a version of yourself that is whole, right? That is supported. And so just having imagery that we can reframe, even if that initial image is activating, we can recreate that image. We have the power to recreate that image in a way that is beautiful, right? And so one of the ways that I can suggest to you, right, is to, if you are adept at, apps, there's this one app that I use called Bazaart, Bazaart. And so what I've done for friends on their birthdays, I'll make inner child art for them. And so yeah, I just collage different things, right? So it's like digital collaging. And so it'll be a picture of them, but then I'll ask them, what are colors that you loved as a child? What was your favorite animal? Things like that. And so then I'll like place all these things around them so that they're held by all of the things that did make them feel love, right? And so that's one way to kind of to heal that visual element. But there's there's auditory elements. There's laying in grass, right? Like it sounds really simple, but just like really connecting back to earth, because earth is really your first mother, right? And so you don't necessarily have to come back to anything outside of yourself. It really is just coming back to the elements and to earth and to visualizing yourself as whole.
And I think that's a wonderful summary to the presentation. And Leslie, I just want to thank you again. The suggestions, the insights that you have, it's allowed for a lot of introspection, connecting with what shaped us as adults, reconnecting with our inner child, and seeking the impact within our inner parent. So again, just to recapture what Leslie's presentation is and the resources, you can download the PowerPoint in the control window as well. Let me make sure I hear. So registration. So we do have registration for our 2022 Kids Count Conference, and I think you can jump to the next slide there.
Sure. I went too fast. Sorry about that.
If you can join us on November 1st and 2nd, it is coming quick, but the theme is as we move forward together for Indiana's youth. LeVar Burton, as you see here, his face might be nostalgic to a lot of you. He's a renowned literacy advocate, and he will be joining us as our keynote. So be sure to check out the link for the rest of the speakers and the workshop lineup. Again, that's November 1st and 2nd in Indianapolis. It feels like a national conference, but it's just for Indiana youth workers of all sorts of Indiana youth serving fields. And as we conclude, I want to also thank our attendees who joined us today. So thank you so much. We appreciate your impact and the value, your voice, and the choice you made to learn with us and as a partner with IYI today. Later today, as I mentioned earlier, you will receive a link to complete an evaluation, and that is valuable to us because that makes our work valuable to you, and we want to really pour into what you are doing and walk with you. So please take a few minutes to let us know about today's presentation. Again, if you don't receive it, check your junk or spam folder. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of completion. So if you do need that, complete that evaluation to get to that certificate of completion. And that concludes our presentation today. And on behalf of Indiana's youth, I want to thank Leslie. I want to thank you again for showing up today and every day for Indiana's youth. Thanks so much for attending.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.